gratitude for the voices, the rhythms, and the dreams that unite us all. This is Africa with Channel Africa, the African perspective.
Es-tu préoccupé par quelque chose? Es-tu passionné par les questions qui comptent? As-tu une voix qui mérite d'être entendue? Eh bien, nous avons la plateforme parfaite pour toi. Téléphone-nous ou fais-nous un WhatsApp au +27 66 408 87 42 et nous te rappellerons. Sois dans la conversation.
Salut Channel Africa, ici Beno le diamant rouge et Binal Sport depuis le Cameroun, le pays des lions. Voilà.
Sois dans la conversation. Il ne s'agit pas seulement de parler, mais c'est ta chance d'exprimer ton point de vue, de partager tes opinions et de t'engager avec une communauté qui valorise ton avis. Suivez-nous sur les réseaux sociaux, visitez notre site www.channelafrica.co.za et préparez-vous à partager vos points de vue sur Channel Africa, la perspective africaine.
It's time for Africa World Hour with Tsepiso Makwetla. Stay tuned for insights, impact, and inspiration right here on Channel Africa. Available on the Channel Africa app.
And it's just a little after 9. A very good evening to a warm welcome to Africa World Hour here on the African Perspective, Channel Africa. As we usually say here, from the heart of Africa to all corners of the globe. Well, guess what? Big things were happening in the heart of Africa. Big things were happening in South Africa, and we're going to unpack them, what their long-term impact are, if even though not binding in written, or rather in written print, how binding are they from a moral perspective? Talking about world leaders gathering for the G20, and now we're seeing the EU-Africa summit also underway. So let's get straight into it. Our top stories first.
Tsepiso Makwetla winds it down on Africa World Hour, 9 to 10 p.m.
So vote counting is underway in Guinea-Bissau following a presidential and legislative election. Incumbent President Umaro Sissoco Embalo is in a tight contest to become the first leader in 3 decades to win a second consecutive term in the West African nation. The 53-year-old former army general is up against 11 other candidates. Analysts are predicting a close race, and a runoff will be held if no candidate gets more than 50% of the vote. Laboratory of African and Post-Colonial Studies at Sheikh Anta Diop University in Dakar, Senegal, Professor Gogol Dieng.
Guinea-Bissau is, since its independence, 9 coups d'etats. That means that the country is not a stable one. So this election might lead to more stability and more democracy. But I believe that that will not be easy for the outgoing president. In Africa, in general, the days following elections are always marked by violence. Because I saw the voting yesterday, but and on the whole, it was a peaceful election. So the results can be considered to be fairly obtained by the winner or the loser, and the loser must accept.
The U.S. designation of the Venezuelan cartel de las Soles as a foreign terrorist organization has come into force. This comes as Washington ramps up pressure on President Nicolas Maduro. The BBC's Mimi Swabi has those details.
As Venezuelans anxiously await a supposed new phase of Washington's Operation Southern Spear, the designation of Cartel de los Soles grants the US more legal power in what it insists is a fight against drugs. The Trump administration accuses the cartel of trafficking and says it's headed by President Nicolas Maduro and his officials. Venezuela's government has rejected what it called a ridiculous plan to designate a non-existent group. It says Washington's true motive is regime change. US pressure has been mounting, heightened by the arrival of the world's largest warship to the South Caribbean.
A far-right politician has provoked anger in the Australian Senate for wearing a burqa after she was denied permission to introduce a bill banning the Islamic head garment. The session was suspended when Pauline Hanson of the anti-immigration One Nation Party refused to remove it. Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong has condemned Hanson's actions.
We represent people of every faith, of all backgrounds, and we should do so decently. And what we should not do in this place, whatever views we may have on policy, is to be this disrespectful of the chamber and of people of faith. Whatever our own beliefs may be, the sort of disrespect that you are engaging in now is not worthy of a member of the Australian Senate.
And the leader of an online sex crime group in South Korea has been sentenced to life in prison. A court convicted Kim Nok-wan of sexually exploiting dozens of people, many of them underage girls, on an encrypted app. The BBC's Jake Kwan reports from Seoul.
Kim Nok-wan lured his victims on Telegram, the messaging app that guarantees the user's privacy. He offered to create deepfake sexual images and in exchange asked to see their IDs, which he then used to blackmail them. The police found at least 261 victims, including at least 159 in their teens. The investigation dragged for more than a year, but the breakthrough came when Telegram shared their user's identity with the South Korean police for the first time.
And finally, negotiations on a deal to end war in Ukraine are continuing after Washington and Kiev reported progress in talks. The U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that there were just a couple of issues still being resolved, though he and other key actors have now left Geneva. The Estonian Foreign Minister Margus Tsahkna says there are some points Ukraine can't compromise on.
Russia will remain an aggressive country. And as well, if we are talking about the security guarantees, these security guarantees must follow the Article 5 principle as well. We cannot take down from the table the opportunity for the future membership of NATO for Ukraine. This is our regional and also European security. So there cannot be any kind of deals without Europe and Ukraine about us. It's very clear.
We are on Open Views Audio Bouquet. Channel 628.
Es-tu préoccupé par quelque chose? Es-tu passionné par les questions qui comptent? As-tu une voix qui mérite d'être entendue? Eh bien, nous avons la plateforme parfaite pour toi. Téléphone-nous ou fais-nous un WhatsApp au +27 66 408 87 42 et nous te rappellerons. Sois dans la conversation.
Salut Channel Africa, ici Beno le diamant rouge et Bina l'Esport depuis le Cameroun, le pays des lions. Voilà.
Sois dans la conversation. Il ne s'agit pas seulement de parler, mais c'est ta chance d'exprimer ton point de vue, de partager tes opinions et de t'engager avec une communauté qui valorise ton avis. Suivez-nous sur les réseaux sociaux, visitez notre site www.channelafrica.co.za et préparez-vous à partager vos points de vue sur Channel Africa, la perspective africaine.
Tsepiso Makwetla winds it down on Africa World Hour, 9 to 10 p.m.
And it is now 9:09. The European Union has praised South Africa for embracing multilateralism amid a boycott by the world's #1 economy. Addressing a media briefing on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Johannesburg on Friday, European Union President Ursula von der Leyen and European Union Council President Antonio Costa say the bloc will defend multilateralism and will double down on rules-based trade. Dick Makazolo-Shoro has those details.
The pair have committed to remaining predictable and reliable partners in facing key challenges of trade, finance and climate change. A day after signing key partnership agreements with South Africa on trade, investment and critical minerals, EU leaders Ursula von der Leyen, who heads the European Union, and Antonio Costa, who leads the EU Council, say they play by the rules.
We are a partner that plays by the rules. That's important for us. We listen to our partners. And above all, we deliver mutual gains in trade and investment, which in return delivers good jobs. We believe in the mutual gain in trade and investment.
Von der Leyen says the EU wants to be Africa's partner of choice in the face of fragmentation and as countries look for alternative markets and partners following the disruption caused by the United States tariffs.
The European Union wants to be Africa's partner of choice. That is for us important. And the opportunity is now, and therefore I welcome that there is a side event here at G20. This afternoon, together with President Ramaphosa, we will host the final pledging event of our campaign called Scaling Up Renewables for Africa. It will be a key moment because we will convene governments and investors and philanthropists to come together and to power Africa's future.
Costa says it is important for countries to diversify supply chains and reduce dependencies.
Concentrated production increases geopolitical and economic risks. We must build strategic autonomies. This requires us to engage with different parts of the world and with new partnerships while strengthening existing ones. This is what the G20 enables us to do on development, on trade, on climate, on critical minerals, or artificial intelligence.
In addition, he says the European Union is eager to work with G20 partners to make the global financial architecture more inclusive and efficient.
We are taking positive steps to make the international financing architecture more inclusive, efficient, and representative, to ease the debt burden that prevents developing countries from investing in their own future.
Van der Leyen says Africa's renewable energy capability must be scaled up and its solar potential harnessed, pointing out that only 2% of the $2 trillion investment towards cleaner energy comes to Africa.
For the clean transitions to really succeed, it must happen everywhere. That's important. And this is where reliable cooperation between trusted partners is yet again the best way forward.
The pair have praised South Africa for pushing multilateralism forward as host of the G20, despite being boycotted by the world's leading economy.
And South Africa put multilateralism to work. And I would like to commend President Ramaphosa and the South African team. You have done an exceptional work towards reaching an agreed leaders' outcome from this summit. We are looking forward to the discussions ahead. Thank you very much.
Yeah, let me first also say together with President Costa that the European Union is very pleased to be here in Johannesburg. The G20 summit is the first on African soil. It is the first since the African Union joined as a permanent member. And this is highlighting Africa's central and vital role on the global stage and the leadership of President Ramaphosa and South Africa.
The EU leaders will meet African leaders at their summit early next week. For Channel Africa News, Zamdima Gatsole-Shoro in Johannesburg.
It is now 14 minutes past 9, so let's continue on that. As we mentioned, South Africa basking in praise from President Cyril Ramaphosa's after what he calls a highly successful hosting of the G20 Leaders Summit. Speaking after leaders wrapped up their talks in Johannesburg, Ramaphosa said the summit has not only strengthened South Africa's standing in global affairs, but will also help drive growth across the continent. He added that the outcomes of the summit could unlock new investment, boost the economy, and ultimately create much-needed jobs for South Africans. We speak now to Lwazi Somya, an international relations analyst from the Institute for Global Dialogue. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us.
Good evening, and thank you for inviting me. I'm from Selo. Apologies about that.
You're from? My apologies. You're from which organization?
The Southern African Liaison Office. Apologies about that.
No, apologies from us for getting it wrong. So let's just go back to the outcome. There was a declaration, which was what everybody was looking out for, and looking to the language of the declaration to see whether or not South Africa can call this truly successful. But we've just heard from the EU leaders there. they congratulating South Africa. We're now at a point where there is the EU Africa Summit. So within that context, the core finding of the report, can we see it as a blueprint for how the EU and Africa are going to move forward, particularly the various regional economic blocs?
Well, the G20 itself being a non-binding entity and a largely informal institution itself, these recommendations are non-binding. However, these recommendations are agenda setting in terms of they create the foundations to which various actors that are involved within the G20 process can engage in multilateral forums. For example, many of the G20 issues will be taken up at the United Nations, especially the United Nations Economic Commission on Africa, along with the African Union having to take up various aspects of the G20 recommendations. For example, issues around the critical minerals framework and beneficiation will be the foundational documents that African countries and the global South actors will be deliberating upon when conducting their domestic policy deliberations when it comes to issues around critical minerals. This also impacts on the agreement between the European Union and the African states, including the bilateral relationship that South Africa has with its European and other global actors concerning issues around critical minerals, climate financing, especially relating to disaster risk management and protection of vulnerabilities, along with investments in accordance to climate change and the disaster risk management and lowering that. There's also another additional aspect in which South Africa co-chairs the Compact with Africa, and which now is there's a steady drive towards increasing private investment within Africa under a new Compact with Africa 2.0, and with the German government itself is firmly a supporter. And then there's an inequalities report, which itself will be served within the United Nations in order for us to derive a more meaningful global order in terms of dealing with issues around inequalities that exist.
So let's talk about just in terms of the structural and operational recommendations. The G20 report in particular giving specific examples to enhance the G20's effectiveness and continuity. So the commitment to integrity, improving the thematic reports, for instance, and establishing earlier and closer engagement with working groups, leaders, declarations, keeping that final. There's a sense of transparency. But in it, would you say, when you read those, that there seems to be an acknowledgement of the structural weaknesses of the G20 and its lack of efficacy?
This is not only related to the G20 itself. The structural weaknesses are now manifesting throughout the entire international system, and the G20 itself acknowledging these structural weaknesses and attempting to find a means towards aligning and having some form of continuity only poses one question, is that's the question around whether the G20 itself is sustainable, realizing the emerging pressures that are stemming from the dominant partners within the G20 framework, in particular the United States. Although there might be headwinds towards the G20 and these recommendations itself leaning towards dealing with these headwinds, there is a fundamental question whether or not the international multilateral architecture itself is adaptable enough to realize the growing pressures of a changing international system. And therefore, these recommendations, even though the G20 itself is not a non-binding international forum, does signal to a more created risk that might be manifested in other multilateral fora where they want to show-proof them for changing headwinds going forward, even post-Donald Trump administration.
And let's just go straight there to the Donald Trump administration, because there is a call for alignment in terms of the president's office, and referring here to the leadership of the G20, and also calls for earlier and more informal engagement with the Sherpas. Is that in itself an admission that there could be a misalignment, if that is the correct term to frame it as, in terms of, if we look at what civil society is demanding and what the final outcome is, and particularly at implementation phase, is there an admission that there are deep structural weaknesses, but also misalignments within the G20 itself.
Yes, there is sort of a tentative admission towards that, but we must also remember that each and every single G20, due to the informal nature of it, is defined by the host countries' both domestic and international concerns. For example, in South Africa, we highly are leveraged upon our domestic concerns, especially concerning issues around debt, inequality, poverty, food security, and our relationship with the African continent as central components within our G20 presidency. Whilst these matters are not also only isolated to South Africa, but the African continent and the global south, countries such as the United States will seek to also project their domestic policies onto the G20 framework. Therefore, when you look at the transition between South Africa and the United States in the coming year, you will see now a transition of some of the domestic concerns that the United States has had, especially in relation to issues around tariffs and trade. And when you look at issues around lessening the G20 agenda to exclude what Donald Trump and the Republican colleagues deem as diversity, equality, and inclusion initiatives, whilst in South Africa we regard those as a cornerstone of our foreign policy, as our history has dictated. So what you will see is that countries will continue to lay their thumbprints onto the G20 according to their presidencies, and whether the formalization of the G20 will have adverse effects on the G20 itself, or whether this lack of formalization will might regard in the disintegration of the G20, resulting in other areas of engagement for these particular matters, is left up to be seen. Especially when you see when Donald Trump takes up the G20 presidency following a midterm elections, how that will impact his presidency and U.S. priorities going forward. And therefore, when we look at each and every single G20 process, one must also take into consideration the domestic impacts of what is happening in those particular countries, but also how those domestic issues are then projected onto the international stage.
And I mean, it just makes me think of one of the conversations we had with one of the political analysts over the weekend about how to enmesh domestic imperatives and national agendas under the broader umbrella of what is of global interest. And of course, the balance of power is something to talk about. But the point I was getting to with the previous question is, can we say there's a difference between, when we talk about the inclusion, is it more co-option? But you spoke about debt, so let's stick with that national debt. And this is the end of the first cycle of the G20, is it not? If my information is correct, because I think President Donald Trump starts the next cycle, with next year being 2026. So are some of these declarations strong enough? And I'm talking here about, could they have been more bolder? Could it have been more substantial when we talk about debt servicing? Could there have been a suggestion maybe of a new global sovereign commitment or debt restructuring mechanism rather?
So, due to the informality of the G20 and how it's structured to garner consensus, a lot of the wording would not be as strong or sufficient to us, the normal layman audience, in terms of these negotiation processes. However, there have been a number of push forwards in terms of the way forward, in terms of some of the existing global governance structures. For example, on the critical minerals framework, that sets the parameters towards how African governments and global South actors are now going to play the international game on trade and their value chains, in terms of how they deal with critical minerals, where the fundamental issue is beneficiation at the source of extraction in order for you to create jobs within those localities. And on the issue of around debt, issues around the common framework around debt within the G20 be more responsive towards developing countries in the global south. That is a major win for South Africa. But also issues around the cost of capital and inequalities, which is highlighted around the inequalities report, which places a higher tax burden on the super rich within the international framework with the aim of lessening inequalities within countries. However, there are some shortfalls. For example, the critical minerals framework does not set timelines, it doesn't set percentages for beneficiation in the localities, but those issues are issues to be left at the national level to be deliberated. However, there is a common framework that can be deliberated upon by both state, non-state actors, business and private sectors in collaboration with these various governments. But at least for now, there is that locked in agenda setting on how these various matters are supposed to be deliberated upon and dealt with at an international level.
Well, thank you very much for that, and hopefully next time we will have a conversation about, what are the metrics, how does the G20 measure the impact in terms of real world change? Speaking to us there from the Southern African Liaison Office on the outcome of the G20 statement, Lwazi Somya is from the Southern African Liaison Office.
We are on Open Views Audio Bouquet. Channel 628.
Es-tu préoccupé par quelque chose? Es-tu passionné par les questions qui comptent? As-tu une voix qui mérite d'être entendue? Eh bien, nous avons la plateforme parfaite pour toi. Téléphone-nous ou fais-nous un WhatsApp au +27 66 408 87 42 et nous te rappellerons. Sois dans la conversation.
Salut Channel Africa, ici Beno le diamant rouge et Bina l'export depuis le Cameroun, le pays des lions. Voilà.
Sois dans la conversation. Il ne s'agit pas seulement de parler, mais c'est ta chance d'exprimer ton point de vue, de partager tes opinions et de t'engager avec une communauté qui valorise ton avis. Suivez-nous sur les réseaux sociaux, visitez notre site www.channelafrica.co.za et préparez-vous à partager vos points de vue sur Channel Africa, la perspective africaine.
Channel Africa, where every moment is an African celebration. Feel the energy. Feel the connection. Channel Africa, the African perspective. Tsepiso Makwetla winds it down on African World Hour, 9 to 10 p.m.
And it is now 27 minutes past 9. We continue giving you the African perspective on some of the continental, regional and international developments. And we look back and still looking into South Africa's G20 security cluster. It says it is satisfied with its handling of the security operations during this historic summit, the first ever held on African soil. On the final day of the gathering on Sunday, officials from the Border Management Authority and the South African Police Service told Channel Africa that the event remained incident-free. Only a few planned protests were recorded outside of the Nasrec Expo Center in Johannesburg, including a demonstration by anti-immigrant group Operation Tutula, which attempted to gain access to the venue to voice its concerns to world leaders, but was denied. Channel Africa's Michael Mbewe was there.
Following the successful hosting of the G20 summit in Johannesburg, leaders of key law enforcement agencies, including the Border Management Authority and the South African Police Service, expressed satisfaction with their efforts to keep the event as safe as possible, with the global figures such as India's Narendra Modi, Turkey's Tayyip Erdogan, and Brazil's Lula da Silva descending on South African shores to help shape the future of international cooperation. Security operations were significantly intensified. This heightened readiness ensured that the summit proceeded smoothly and remained free of major incidents, reinforcing South Africa's capability to host high-level global gatherings. Speaking to Channel Africa, PMS Commissioner Michael Masiapato said this time the agency was proactive.
As the Border Management Authority, we are very much excited that this time around we were very much proactive in terms of facilitating the people that were coming for the G20. So what we did, we actually ahead of time engaged with DERCO and made sure that effective communication goes to all the countries in terms of the key requirements for them to enter the Republic. Those that needed visas were very much explicit. For those that needed, for example, yellow fever certificates, we were very much explicit. And on the basis of that proactive communication, we can really confirm that things went very much well. There hasn't been much challenge.
Masiapato says the BMA dealt with minor incidents concerning agricultural biosecurity.
But of course, as part of the normal practice, from an agricultural biosecurity point of view, we did have incidences there and there where people came with agricultural products, whether it's animal products or even plant and products, and they tried to actually come with those in the country. And unfortunately for those we had to confiscate, we had to get them destroyed on that basis. So those are not serious issues per se, but those are just ordinary part of the work. We have to make sure that we send them to the incineration and get them effectively destroyed. So all of those things actually were done just to make sure that everything goes well.
Effective queue management was applied in the ports of entry to deal with the surging influx of summit delegates.
The issues of the queues and all of those, we didn't have any of those. Out of the 44 cubicles at OR Tambo, for instance, they were all taken care of, together with the 4 additional ones, for the purposes of dealing with health issues.
The South African Police Service's National Deputy Commissioner, Tibello Mosikili, gave a moving tribute to her troops who raised the security bar, including restricting protesters from the venue.
Maybe with that comment, it will be unreasonable and unethical of me not to thank the officers and the members. They heeded to the call, and here we are today, incident-free event. There are things that happened, they happened outside of this, but because we have planned for any eventuality anywhere else in around Gauteng and in the country, because there are those protest marches that Women for Change, that was countrywide. They were planned for, they were escorted, they were ushered to the places of their choice where they want to voice and air their concerns.
However, the event almost got overshadowed by South African anti-migrant movement Operation Dudula protesters who attacked law enforcers but were neutralized.
It's just unfortunate that here around Gauteng, there was that incident that happened with Operation Dudula. There was a protest march, and Operation Dudula wanted to access the area that is restricted, area that has been declared as a sterile area for the operational members to operate. They were directed into the designated area to go and do and air their voices, raise their voices as loud as they can, have allocated authority that will go and address them, but that was not good enough, and they attacked. So when you attack the state, as we have indicated, that please air your voices, but remain within the confines of the law, which is what we need to respect as a sovereign country, that we do have protocols, security protocols in the country that we need to follow.
Michael Mbewe, Channel Africa News, Johannesburg.
Let's continue now with developments across the continent and beyond. South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa has touched down in Luanda, Angola, to take part in the 7th African Union-European Union Summit. The two-day meeting brings together African and European leaders to strengthen political trade and development partnerships. Ramaphosa is expected to join discussions on peace, security and economic cooperation as the continent looks to deepen its engagement with the EU. We speak now to political analyst Professor Begitemba Mgomezu. A very good evening to you, Prof. Thank you so much for speaking to us. So there's some form of continuity given the fact that EU and African leaders would have been speaking at the G20, on the sidelines of the G20. So this 7th AU-EU summit, what strategic purpose would you say it then serves?
Thank you very much, Tsepiso, for having me, and good evening to your viewers. Yes, indeed. This particular gathering that is now gathering in Luanda, in Angola, started in the year 2000, as you just pointed out, that is now 25 years old. And then at the time, this was called the EU-Africa Partnership, because at the time, we did not have this, OAU. AU, as we call it now. So in 2017, in Cote d'Ivoire, that's when they changed the name then to AU-EU Summit. Basically, they normally look at issues that are of interest to the continent, and then, of course, to Europe, because it's a partnership between the two continents, Africa and Europe. This time around, there are a couple of issues, one of which is security, which basically affects both continents, that is Africa and Europe. And they are also dealing with issues of migration and economy. Those are some of the pertinent issues. Of course, we cannot talk about economy without talking about security, because any country and any region that is not secured will definitely have some economic turmoil. The same happens when there is political turmoil, it will have a direct impact on the economy. So those are some of the issues. And you are right in also saying that there's a link between this meeting and the just concluded G20 summit, because they were tackling similar issues. Then they might amplify them now that they have this two-day meeting, and then they have a clear agenda as to what they want to discuss.
And just what I'll be saying, obviously, is based on what President Ramaphosa's own speech at the AU summit is. He mentioned, and it was also part of the declaration at the G20, that he believes in a rules-based international order system. And there is the balance of power, which we can't ignore. The fact that the AU, for instance, only had observer status at the G20 summit, and now we have the AU-EU summit. The EU certainly did posture itself in a manner that says it is supportive of Africa. But when it comes down to it, and I'm talking about putting your money where your mouth is, so to speak, how are we going to see EU leaders move? Is there going to be a recognition of that multipolarity?
Tsepiso, countries have no choice. There are times when you have a multipolar world, which is what we had before the Second World War, which ended in 1945. Then, unfortunately, from 1945 onwards, we had a bipolar world, the West being controlled by America and the East being controlled by Russia. Then in 1989, 1990, there was a fall of communism/socialism, and then Russia fell off the radar, and we're left with a unipolar world dominated by America, which is why then American hegemony has been dominating. Right now, we're going back to a multipolar world because we have different voices. Some economies are coming up. China is becoming a contender. Many countries in the Asian world are becoming contenders. So then we are moving back to the multipolar world. So in this case, then, you expect countries to respect one another, and you respect regions to respect one another. But the truth be told, Tsepiso, there is a difference between the global north and the global south. And then part of the reason for these differences is that African leaders rarely speak in one voice. We are still divided. And then when we go to these European former colonizers, I must add, we go there as individual countries instead of speaking in one voice as Africans, which is what the AU is trying to do. But so far, I don't think the AU has succeeded in doing that. You see that even when the AU has its own meetings, when it is electing the AU commission officials, so you can see that there are these differences that are happening. So, but then right now, after the G20, you saw a number of commitments from countries like France, individual countries, not necessarily EU as a bloc, but you saw individual countries showing support for African countries, more especially in this case, South Africa, the likes of France, the likes of Germany, and a couple of other countries. But it's easier said than done, because promising is one thing, and then putting that promise into practice is something else. Let's just play a wait and see game. But from the promises that we got, we may be optimistic that things are going to change.
And you know, I think one does wonder for how long we have to wait for, because these former colonial powers who still behave as colonial powers, one does beg the question just how genuine the pronouncements of some form of equal partnership. And I say some form of because if you look at who the EU leaders are in terms of governance, Europe is certainly moving to the right. So when we talk about the EU's geopolitical interests in Africa, we're talking minerals, energy, migration control, etc., etc. Is that possible? A genuine, equal relationship between the two regions?
I will answer your question, Tsepiso, by bringing in a theory which we call realism. A realism is said to be state-centric in the sense that whatever you do, you first ask the question, what is in it for me as a state? Be it state A or state B, whatever the case is. So whenever states enter into bilateral relations, they enter into regional relations, continental relations, and they go to these multinational forums. They first look at their own interest, national interests, and then based on that, they then engage other countries or other partners. The same will apply in this case. You may find that some of these European countries may have made promises, but then when it comes to implementation, it might be a different ballgame altogether. Let's say, hypothetically speaking, you have a president or a prime minister making that particular promise. Then he still has to go back to his government and then say, okay, this is what I've promised our country is going to do. Let us vote on this. You may find that there might be differences of opinion from within the leader's political party and then also from the opposition political parties. Then you may find that there is a delay in the implementation process. In some instances, in fact, that promise might not even come to fruition. Then the last factor is that you also have these countries having relations with other countries, which goes back to the point I made earlier on about forming bilateral relations. Do you put bilateral relations before your regional agreements or before you come up with your multilateral institutions? Those are some of the issues that these leaders will have to navigate. If, for example, a country X, has strong relations with America, and America doesn't like South Africa, so chances are you may find that they will no longer implement what they promised they were going to do. So that's why I'm saying it's a wait-and-see game. But I take your question that for how long? That's a very critical question because Africa and South Africa in particular, we need those changes and we need them as in yesterday. And we have no time to wait. And therefore, it's urgent for us, but it might not be urgent for them for the reasons I've just outlined.
And I also asked this question against the backdrop of colleague Peter Ndoro was saying he was speaking to Dr. Nkonjo Iweala, the WTO Director General, and she was saying we need to tread very carefully, steady goes it when it comes to a confrontational posture with some of these leaders. But if you look at the AU's theme this year, it's on reparations and historical justice. Justice for Africans and people of African descent through reparations. So some of these deals that we are going to be trying to create will need to take that into account, the issue of reparations. And I'm just wondering, can Africa pursue some of these things just in terms of the international legal and diplomatic architecture in these conversations that they're having? Have that approach in mind that some of these things really are part of the reparations agenda we're seeking?
Ideally, it should work, but then it will only work if Africans are speaking in one voice. The point I made earlier on is that Africans are not united. The point that Nkonjo Iweala was making, she's a Nigerian, and then she understands things from an African perspective, but then currently she's working for a multilateral institution, and she also understands how things operate on the other side of the table. So then I think her comment then was based on that. The reality here is that the issue of reparations is in fact a long overdue, given the fact that the reason why the continent is not developing is on the one part because of external causal factors, which I normally refer to as exogenous causal factors. But on the other hand, Africans are also to blame because there are certain decisions that we take which in fact take us further down. Instead of at least keeping us to where our ex-colonizers left us, we are pushing ourselves down and we're hoping that someone will be a messiah and then will come and lift us up. That is not going to happen. So the only time change will happen and happen faster is when Africans unite and speak in one voice. The fact that we have so many minerals across the African continent means that we have a potential to grow as a continent. The fact that we have a young population means that we have a potential to build this continent and then overshadow anyone else, including countries in Europe, including even America and many other countries. But we are not going to do that until we change the way we do things. One point will be industrialization. If we do industrialize, then chances are we're going to jumpstart our economies, we're going to address the issue of poverty and unemployment and a couple of other challenges. We're not going to solve everything. There is no panacea to solving all our problems, but let's start from where things are possible. And the first thing is for us uniting and then speaking in one voice and taking care of our minerals and building industries. Then we'll be on the right track. Until we do that, we may then forget about developing this continent because Europe is not going to come and rescue us. They will first rescue themselves, then they will rescue us later, if ever there is still money left.
Of course, as you say, because the multilateral system is still stuck in 1945, isn't it, Professor? Thank you so much for speaking to us just about that EU-AU summit that is taking place, speaking to us, unpacking the importance of the summit and some of the issues that will come to the fore. Speaking to us there is Professor Bengmuzi, just talking to us about what some of the issues are, and we will come back to some of the other issues that we haven't discussed yet.
We are on Open Views Audio Bouquet, Channel 628. With gratitude for the voices, the rhythm, and the dreams that unite us all.
Roho ya Afrika inaishi katika kila hadithi tunayosimulia.
Each new day is a gift, a reminder to pause, to breathe, and to give thanks for the laughter we share and the journeys we take and the stories that shape who we are.
Cada nascer do sol lhe lembre de algo pelo qual ser grato. La vie est un voyage, parcourons-la avec gratitude.
Channel Africa. Celebrate the beauty of life with gratitude for the voices, the rhythms, and the dreams that unite us all. This is Africa with Channel Africa, the African perspective.
Es-tu préoccupé par quelque chose? Es-tu passionné par les questions qui comptent? As-tu une voix qui mérite d'être entendue? Eh bien, nous avons la plateforme parfaite pour toi. Téléphone-nous ou fais-nous un WhatsApp au +27 66 408 87 42 et nous te rappellerons. Sois dans la conversation.
Salut Channel Africa, ici Beno le diamant rouge et Bina l'export depuis le Cameroun, le pays des lions. Voilà.
Sois dans la conversation. Il ne s'agit pas seulement de parler, mais c'est ta chance d'exprimer ton point de vue, de partager tes opinions et de t'engager avec une communauté qui valorise ton avis. Suivez-nous sur les réseaux sociaux, visitez notre site www.channelafrica.co.za et préparez-vous à partager vos points de vue sur Channel Africa, la perspective africaine.
Tsepiso Makwetla winds it down on Africa World Hour, 9 to 10 p.m.
Okay, thank you to Professor Begitemba Mgomezulu, who we just spoke to. Now let's move on to other issues, and we take you to this conversation, and we're talking about the South African Human Rights Commission. We are talking about their own investigation. It's released a hard-hitting investigative report into the collapse of municipal service delivery across the Northwest Province. The Commission says that chronic collapse of delivery service is clear in the province, saying that governance failures, financial mismanagement, and deteriorating infrastructure have left many communities without reliable access to water, sanitation, refuse removal, and other basic services. We speak to Shirley Mlombo, provincial manager of the South African Human Rights Commission in the Northwest. A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for speaking to us. Okay, we're going to get back to her. Shirley Mlombo, they have, as a Human Rights Commission, put out a report with the most alarming of findings, and it has identified the Northwest Province pretty much as the worst performing in the country, saying something like where human rights violations are so permissive, saying that if there's one province in South Africa that is so bad at violating human rights, it is the Northwest Province. That report was actually released last week. So a series of complaints regarding service delivery challenges across several municipalities, including water, sanitation, waste management, and road maintenance, led to this investigation. The report reveals widespread non-compliance with constitutional and legislative obligations by municipalities in the Northwest Province. And if you have been, I don't know, but the last time I went to the Northwest Province, the roads are so bad. The potholes are literally the size of craters. I actually said to someone once that the last time I was there, I can see children, and I'm not suggesting this, but because children are precocious by their nature, literally playing in those holes, the swimming pools. That's how big they are. Just to drive around there, I personally don't understand how people in the Northwest Province function because of those failures. But the South African Human Rights Commission is saying really that most municipalities are failing to meet those constitutional and legislative obligations, and as a consequence, many of them are violating several human rights through failing to provide basic services. Let's see if we do have Shirley Mlombo back on the line. She's the provincial manager of the South African Human Rights Commission in the Northwest. Shirley, are you back with us? Okay, we're going to take a quick break.
Quer que a sua música seja tocada no Canal África? Quer que as pessoas saibam sobre o seu talento musical? Quem és? Onde és? Os teus principais interesses? E assim poderemos tocar a sua música no Canal África. Quer saber como fazer isso? É simples. Envie a sua música para music@channelafrica.co.za e deixe-nos tocá-la. Canal África, a perspectiva africana.
Okay, we're going to go back to Shirley Mlombo, who is a provincial manager of the South African Human Rights Commission in the Northwest. She's speaking to us about this investigative report that they put out on the collapse of municipal service delivery across the Northwest Province. A very good evening to you, Ms. Mlombo, and thank you so much for speaking to us.
Good evening, Tsepiso. I'm not sure if I'm audible.
Now you are.
Now?
Now you are. Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. So let's start with what prompted you to launch an investigation into service delivery in the Northwest Province. I mean, this has been an ongoing problem for so long. It almost feels like people in the Northwest Province have been forgotten because there has been zero change in the badly deteriorating situation when it comes to service delivery.
Tsepiso, and good evening also to your viewers. The South African Human Rights Commission in the Northwest has over the years received several service delivery complaints, which range from complaints relating to water access, sanitation, sewer spillages, access to electricity, and as you've raised, the important issue of roads as well. And over and above the complaints that we've received from individuals, organizations, as well as public representatives, we have also, through our monitoring work, picked up some of these complaints as we go into communities to assess the state of service delivery. And given the overwhelming number of the complaints that we had, we then decided to investigate the issue at a systemic level, which then led to the investigative report, which is the subject of today's discussion.
So you are saying that, not only is the issue of water access and sanitation the most dysfunctional in areas, but can you just give us a sense of how operational it is from a human rights perspective? As in, is there hope? Are there people who actually do get these services?
Through our investigation, we found that there are communities that don't get water access at all, but there will be some communities that do receive water access, but the access is either inconsistent, leaving communities without water for many days in the year, or sometimes the water that is being provided is not fit for human consumption. So the situation will vary from municipality to municipality. In some areas, you find that the only form of access they have to walk very long distances to get water. In some communities, community members have to travel long distances using wheelbarrows, using donkey carts just for them to have some access to water.
What is the root cause of these legislative and human rights violations?
Many municipalities that we've engaged with, they say to us that they are having challenges in terms of resources, which then renders them unable to maintain infrastructure for service delivery. They also mentioned the issue of vandalism of service delivery infrastructure. In one municipality, for example, they reported that they had repaired the sewer system, but as soon as they had repaired the sewer system, there was vandalism and theft, resulting in the collapse of the system. So this is what the municipalities are telling us. But from our investigation, perhaps the issue of service delivery may play some role. The issue of resources may play some role in the level of service delivery. But at the core, as articulated by our Commissioner Boshoff, there is an apparent culture of lack of care, a lack of planning around constitutional obligations, resulting in many municipalities unable to meet their constitutional obligations because the resources that are available, they're not used to prioritize the delivery of services to communities. And we've also found, and as also reported by Auditor General, you find in many of the municipalities that will tell us they don't have resources to address service delivery concerns. You find there's a lot of wastage, irregular services. So in our assessment, the issue of resources is not a complete answer to the service delivery collapse that we see in many municipalities in the Northwest.
And I'm pretty sure, if I remember, that a lot of these municipalities are actually recipients of qualified reports. The city of Matlosana, JB Marks, local municipality, Makwasi Hills, Dr. Ruth, Sahomodzi, Mompati district municipalities. I mean, there's damning findings against them. And I do thank you for your time. I wish we had more just to speak about these chronic systemic failures and government's culpability in it, whether it's national or provincial. Thank you very much for speaking to us from the South African Human Rights Commission, just on their report. Shirley Mlombo is a provincial manager there in the Northwest. 2 minutes to 10. Let's look at African diaries this evening. Shayla and Kumana.
Hello, ma'am. How are you?
Yeah, finished.
It is done. But listen, in 2 minutes, it is absolutely done. So today we are speaking to social commentators, and we want to learn more about self-love and communal love. The first being, do you believe that the way you present yourself is a reflection of your self-love? Let me start by asking you, do you believe that?
Sure. It's a broad question.
Yeah.
I think yes. But you have seen this. Does that mean I love myself?
All I'm saying is,
does that mean I love myself? Sometimes it's a matter of circumstances.
Yeah.
But I think for most people, the ordinary human being, that's how they would want to. They think about it. What they project on the outside is what they.
Here's my thing. The reality is that the reception you get is what determines or qualifies this feeling of love or not. So is it truly self-loving if you are waiting on a response from the audience?
But that's what I'm saying. If your premise of how you view yourself is based on what you believe is being mirrored back to you, then there is a problem. But if you are putting out into the world, because you can never be, you can't control how you're received.
Yeah.
There'll be the good, there'll be the bad, there'll be the ugly.
And on that very interesting note, let's jump into the second hour where we talk all things communal love and the ability to integrate into community. We're living in a world that punts continuously, repeatedly, be by yourself, be by yourself. You can do things by yourself. Technology gives you that affordability. Everything is at the touch, of this young device that you have in your hand. And so this conjoining of people hand to hand, conversation to conversation, sort of slipping away through the cracks. And so we're saying, how do we navigate being part of community? What are our responsibilities in this present day and age? Do we have a responsibility to each other to begin with? Apart from that which is stated in law, and of course just as a placeholder for respect, but outside that, are we really communal people in 2025?
It's called humanity.
Hey.
So, I mean, you can't avoid people, but at the same time, it's a case of whether or not you do subscribe to the notion of humanity.
Yeah.
And whether we like it, that's why the saying "no man is an island." At least at some point, you need some form of interaction. That's why that's what Benga saw. You do it alone, then you're only dealing with your own perspective.
True. Absolutely. That's what comes up on the show.
All right. Thanks, Shayla. Looking forward to it. And that's it from Africa World Hour this evening. We're out. Good night.
Get Channel Africa on DSTV Audio Bouquet.